In this peaceful spot by the River Brent in West London, St Mary's Perivale has stood for nearly 900 years. Surrounded by its peaceful churchyard, it has survived storms, wars, famines, plagues, and even developers. Acquired in 1976 by a charity set up for the purpose, it has now become one of the most important classical music venues in Britain. We're too small for orchestras, but our size and acoustics give us a perfect venue for chamber music and instrumental recitals. During the recent pandemic, we were not allowed to have a live audience, but we have not only survived but actually thrived by live streaming our concerts. Now, we are thrilled to be able to readmit an audience, but the live streams continue as an essential part of our offering. So, wherever you are, enjoy this concert, and please consider donating via our website. Thank you very much indeed. Good evening and welcome to St Mary's Perivale for a very special occasion tonight. Not a concert for once, something very different, but a lecture all about the history of this wonderful church, which has been here for about 800 plus years, but we've known very little about it, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dermot Doughty, who's done some original research and looking into the history of this wonderful building. And this talk is important not just for this evening, but to lay down on YouTube as a resource for local historians for years to come. So we learn more about this glorious Grade 1 listed building. So I'm going to ask the audience now to give Dermot a big round of applause.
Can you hear me all? There's microphones all over, and yes, I think you can hear me. For those of you who don't know me, I've lived in Ealing for 25 years. I live in Pitshanger, 10 minutes walk away from here. And on retirement, a couple of years back, I decided to take myself off to Oxford to do a postgraduate certificate in architectural history, which was a great experience for myself. As part of that, I had to do a historic building analysis, and this was the building I chose to do my analysis. So I've spent a lot of time measuring and crawling all over this church and looking at the archives in order to get a feel for what this church is about, which I then submitted as part of my coursework in Oxford. In doing the course, I entitled this analysis A Rural Parish Church in London. And I think that duality is quite important, and hopefully by the end of the session you'll realise why I think that's quite an important title. A bit of scene setting. This is the current structure of the church. This will be familiar to many people. It consists of 4 components. It's a tower, a nave, a chancel, and a porch. So 4 separate components. The porch is pretty inconsequential. It's a wooden edifice which has been erected and taken down at various times, but the other 3 components are much more important. And the essay question, the question I'd like to answer is, what caused St Mary's to take its form? And I'll be concentrating on the causes of this building rather than just the building in the abstract. You can't really think about a church without thinking about the parish from which it's derived. And so we need to have a look at the parish of Perivale. The geology of Perivale, chalk, gravel and clay. There's no building stone around. There's no building stone in Middlesex. It's very bereft of that. But there's lots of timber. So it's very heavily forested up until the 15th, 16th century. The parish is very small, 860 acres. It's about a square mile. It's the smallest in the Diocese of London and very small by any national standard. It's also, until recently, very sparsely populated. So in 1820, there were 25 parishioners in 5 houses. So very small, very sparsely populated, which is quite unusual. There's a lot of large, sparsely populated parishes. There's quite a lot of small, densely populated parishes. This is a small, sparsely populated parish. The consequence of which is you don't need a big church. So this church is said to be the smallest church in Middlesex. The nave and chancel are about 15 metres long, and it's about 5 metres wide. So it's a pretty small church. And the incredibly important feature of it is that we're in the floodplain of the River Brent, and the area around is subject to flooding, and that has really governed the whole raft of features of the church. Most importantly, there's no roads around here. A highway, it's called a highway because it's high. You never put a road through an impassable river valley. And the only thing you could use for the land around here is arable agriculture, hay and wheat. There is a photograph of, it's not a particularly good photograph, that's St Mary's in 1906 when it flooded. So you can see that the River Brent is a major determinant of the nature of this parish and indeed the church. Moving swiftly on, when was it built? I'm always asked, when was it built? When I was on my course in Oxford, I was told, don't answer that question, it's a trap. But if I was forced to answer the question, I would say it was built between 1100 and 1965. Which gives the game away, really, because it wasn't built, it evolved. Yeah? And this talk really is about the evolution of this church. But we do have one good hard piece of evidence, in that there's documentary evidence of a church on this site in 1203, which is great because it gives us an anchor to work on. So what I'd like to do is take you through how the church has changed each century from say, 1200. So that's the structure in 1200. There was a massive wave of church building in the 12th century, largely brought about by the Normans coming over here. They wanted to establish their presence on the islands. So they spent 30 or 40 years building castles, then spent 100 years building churches. And this was, and there were thousands of these churches. They often built the churches on the site of Saxon churches, which would typically, certainly in this area, be timber framed. So it's entirely possible that there was a timber framed church on this site, but we have no evidence of it whatsoever. It's just that the Normans often built their churches on Saxon foundations. The church was built by the lord of the manor. It wasn't built by the church, the clergyman. The lord of the manor, who would likely to be one of the de Mandeville family, would have built the church and charged the peasants and serfs a tithe of 10% of their crops in order to fund the church. That's typically how it would work. This is what I call a single-cell church, so it's just the nave. A lot of Norman churches would be twin-cell churches, where there would be a small chancel attached as well. But because this is quite a small church, I would have thought it would be a single-cell church. The door was on the west front, it's now on the south front, and there would have been a thatched roof, which is the predominant building material. The roof is very steeply pitched, and you would want it, if it's thatched, it has to be a steep pitch because you don't want snow or rain accumulating on it. And the walls would be rubble, stone and flint. There's no good building stone around here, but the Normans insisted in building in masonry. Although there was lots of timber, they refused to use timber. It was all masonry. And this is a picture on the south side of the nave. It's where the render has fallen apart, and you can actually see the underlying rock. And you can see that this rubble stone is just basically whatever rocks or pebbles or flints they can be gathered from around the place. It's not quarried stone. It's rubble stone encased in a lime mortar. Whilst it doesn't look very attractive, it's very robust. So the church has been around for 900 years. The walls are 70 centimetres thick, so it doesn't fall down very easily. So all these Norman churches are very, very robustly built, even though some of them are built with this sort of rather dubious material. Moving on, this is the structure 100 years later in 1300, and as you can see, there's a chancel has been constructed. Now, it's important to recognise the impact of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, where the Pope promulgated the doctrine of transubstantiation. So bread and wine gets turned into the body and blood of Jesus is a miracle. So what you've got are genuine bona fide miracles occurring whenever there's a mass around Europe. And this was really quite profound. In a superstitious era, you had to have, if you were going to have a miracle, you wanted a building which was suitable for a miracle to occur. And so throughout all of England and probably Western Europe, chancels were built because chancels were the site of the ceremony, and that's where the miracle would occur. The chancels would have been very ornate. They would have had carvings and stained glass and worthy of ceremony. Now, this chancel is what's known as a weeping chancel. I hope you can see it, but there's a plan of the church, and you can see the chancel at the end is not congruent with the nave. The south side of the chancel is 20 centimetres longer than the north. And the Victorians thought that was a design consideration, and it represented the tilt of Jesus' head on the cross. So it was weeping. That is nonsense. But that was what the Victorians thought. But it is important to see, to consider why that chancel is as it is. And you really need to consider this church as being almost two buildings. The chancel is the preserve of the clergy, and the nave is the preserve of the laity and parishioners. And they were financially different. So the church paid for the chancel, the parishioners paid for the nave. So when they built the chancel, the clergy said, I want this chancel to face east. The fact that the nave was in one direction of the east and they had a different definition of east was of no consequence to them. They were going to build their chancel according to their definitions of east. And so that's why the chancel is at an angle. It's actually fairly common. There's an academic called Ian Hinton who has identified this phenomenon and identified over 1,000 weeping chancels in England. So, and it's designed by the clergy, as I say, and it's a ceremonial space. Importantly, there would have been a screen between the chancel and the nave, and the people in the nave could look into the chancel and see what was going on. But in many churches, the only people allowed into the chancel were clergy. And there would be more than just the priest, there'd be a whole range of chaplains and so forth. So you have to see this as being two buildings separated by a screen, and this is like a stage set. It was a subject of all the ceremony, and it would be lots of ornamentation and stained glass and smells and candles, and it'd be very ceremonial, I suppose. That's the roof screen. And it also reflected, at one sense, a separation of authority. So the church were an authority and the commune were an authority, but they were not integrated. That will become quite important later. Another feature of the chancel is a so-called leper's window. This is another misnomer. There's lots and lots of chancels have this little window. It's usually down here on the south side of the chancel, low down near the nave. And at one stage, it was thought that lepers who were not allowed into the church could actually witness the consecration by looking through that window. That, again, is now thought to be nonsense. The probable use of that was to ring the Sanctus bell. So at the moment of consecration, you'd ring a bell, and you'd ring a bell to let all the peasants toiling in the fields know that there was a miracle going on. There's no belfry at the time, so maybe you'd open a shutter and ring a handbell out the window. So, and the fact that the Sanctus bell is still rang in Catholic Church as far as I can remember. So that's the leper's window. Right, another 400 years, what is the structure in 1400? For those of you with good memories, you'll see that that is unchanged from 1300. So the footprint of the church remains unchanged. But I think there were probably some quite big changes to the roof. So this is the roof as currently exists at the moment. Now, medieval roof structures are the subject of an academic discipline of their own. It's very complex and there's many different forms. But it's useful because it enables you to date a building. So this is a crown post roof. And crown post roofs were very common, certainly in the southeast of England. And they're very common in the late 14th century, going into the 15th century. They tend to be replaced by something called a king post roof later on in the 15th century. So it's not unreasonable to assume that this roof was put in by 1400. And why would you put a roof in? It's probably because they wanted to change the roofing material. Thatch is great because it's light and cheap, but it's flammable. And there's a big move away from thatch. Certainly in London in 1212, thatch was banned as a roofing material. And clay tiles were the common form of roofing. Of course, there's quite a lot of clay in Middlesex. It is one of its good building materials. So my assumption is by 1400, they will replace the thatch roof. And because of the heavier nature of the roofing material, you need a stronger frame. Therefore, there's a crown post roof put in. Moving on, structure in 1500. It's quite a big change here. This is when the tower is built. The tower is added. The door had to be moved, so it's now on the south side. A lot of windows with quite elaborate Gothic tracery were installed. Now, this is the tower. As you can see, it's timber. The incentive to build in stones has gone by then, and timber was much cheaper and a much better medium for building a tower. And towers tended to have two functions. Firstly, it was a source of parochial pride. To say, you know, here we are, it's the centre of the parish. And it also housed the bells. And the bells were quite important for communicating across the parish that there was an event of some sort. This tower had a third function, which was to act as a staircase. So if you look at the east end of the nave, so the west end of the nave, there's a gallery, which I'm fairly certain was added at the same time of the tower. And you can only access the gallery by means of the tower. So the staircase to it is up there. The gallery was probably used for musicians. And it is quite interesting because you can see in this picture, there's the wall, which is obvious. But above the wall, you can see there is all the masonry has been taken down. So in order to build the tower and the gallery, they knocked down the top half of that wall. And you can see that the tower and the gallery are almost one big integrated timber structure, which was added into the end of the nave. So that's where we were in the fateful year 1534. So you talk to architectural historians and they see 1534 as more important than 1066 or 1688 or 1966. It is a serious year because it was the year of the Act of Supremacy, when Henry VIII said, I now control the church. And devastating. And so there's a couple of quotes here, and you can see these eminent architectural historians describe it as a colossal self-inflicted cultural catastrophe and a barbarous Holocaust. They didn't like it. Now, the monasteries at that time, 10% of the wealth of England was held by the monasteries. And Henry VIII came along and just took it all. There were 700 monasteries. He ripped them all apart. His mantra seemed to be, if it was valuable, nick it, and if it was beautiful, burn it. So the monasteries were all ripped apart. But the parish churches were treated somewhat differently because they were actually quite useful. And I tend to think that from about 1534, the parishes became an arm of the state. Rather than a purely local consideration, they became actually a method of local government. So the parishes had to keep a register of birth, deaths and marriages. and the parishes administered the poor law, and eventually they administered roads, toll roads. So Henry VIII couldn't destroy the parishes. The parish churches were very useful for him, but they could change the internal fittings, and that was in response to religious changes. And immediately after Henry VIII's death, I talked the villains. This guy came to the throne, Edward VI. Remarkable, this guy. He came to the throne at the age of 9, died at the age of 15, and encompassed a huge amount of vandalism in his time because he was a Protestant zealot. And he demanded that the churches up and down the country all be changed, their internal fittings be changed. And in particular, he hated idolatry. So any representation of Jesus, angels, saints, had to be got rid of. If there were paintings, they were painted over. Stained glass, it was smashed. And the rude screens between the nave and the chancel were all taken down. So the churches were turned into very austere preaching boxes. That was his aim. Now, he died quite young, so he couldn't complete it. And for about 100 years, the churches continued much as they were. But then Oliver Cromwell came along 100 years later, and he completed the work which Edward VI had started. So every fitting associated with the pre-Reformation was destroyed. And in this church, these are the only items to survive the Reformation. There's a couple of brasses in the floor down there and 2 small bits of stained glass in the north chancel. Everything else was destroyed. So, fair play to them. Then we enter a period of about 300 years, from about 1530 to 1830, where I regard this as being the church as part of the state. And prior to the Reformation, there was a lot of money spent on the church, making it grow and so forth. After the Reformation, there was a lot of money spent on these sorts of things, funerary monuments. You can see a lot of them around here. And it's really common across all parish churches that there's these very elaborate funerary monuments. Now, the important thing to recognise is that the motivation for putting them up is different from pre-Reformation. Prior to the Reformation, any expenditure on the church was either for the glory of God or for the good of the community. Whereas here, these are essentially personal vanity projects. They are for the aggrandizement of the individual. So it's a very different motivation. And perhaps the most interesting of these is the font and its cover, which is at the back there. Now the font is pretty boring, very plain, but the cover is quite interesting. It was inscribed with Simon Coston, Gent, March 26, 1665. So it's got a very firm date on there. What is interesting about it is the ornament on the top, which I think is a pineapple. There you are. Now, pineapples are very, very interesting things. I haven't seen it, I thought I'd do a little bit of research into it. Pineapples could only really be grown in the West Indies. Columbus brought some back in around 1500. But they could never be grown in this country until probably the mid-19th century. So if there were pineapples in this country, they were extremely rare. There were stories of people renting pineapples for dinner parties, not to eat, but just to show off. So the pineapple is a bling item. It's evidence of opulence and money and wealth and hospitality. And if you go around London, if you go around England, you can actually see it around the place. This is Dunmore Park in Scotland. That is 46 foot high. It's owned by the Landmark Trust, and you can stay there if you want. That's the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, pineapple top, and that's Novak Djokovic, who's not a pineapple, but the men's Wimbledon singles trophy has a pineapple on the top. So the pineapples are everywhere. The most famous use of pineapple is in St. Paul's Cathedral. That's the west front of St. Paul's. Everyone should recognise it. And if you look at the top, you see there's a pineapple. And then if you look at the font down there, you see another pineapple. So this is very confusing. What's going on here? Why is there a pineapple in St. Mary's 50 or 60 years before it would be fairly common in the rest of England. And so what we have, the mystery of the Perivale pineapple. It's Enid Blyton would eat your heart out. There's three possibilities. One, it's not a pineapple. Simon Costin liked pine cones and he thought it was a nice shape and put it on top of his font. I don't think that's true. It could be a very early example of a pineapple. And there's a painting in the Royal Collection of King Charles II being presented with a pineapple around 1677. And there's lots of references to pineapples in literature and in books of around this time, but I haven't been able to find any hard examples of real decorative pineapples. Alternatively, it could just be added later. So someone came along and put a pineapple on top of the font cover. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's probably the third. I'd like to think it was the second, but it would be quite rare for a remote rural parish like Perivale to have such an exotic implement. Although Simon Costin's quite interesting. He had a lot of land in Greenford, and there's quite a lot there. There's Coston Brook is actually a tributary of the Brent, so he was a figure of some substance. But we don't know, so I don't have an answer for that one. Anyway, moving on, 1820s, the crisis of Anglicanism. Here's another couple of quotes, and you can see Anglican was corrupt, nepotistic, had sinecures, financial abuses, lack of social and emotional engagement, social exclusivity. It was not a good time for Anglicanism. After 300 years as a state religion, it had gone into something of a crisis. And nonconformists and Catholics were getting much bigger congregations. There were more nonconformist chapels than there were Anglican churches by this time. In addition, the legislation which discriminated against Catholics and nonconformists was all repealed in the 1820s. With the consequence that Anglicanism was in a lot of trouble. And you can actually see that in some of the architecture, interestingly enough. This here is a picture of St. Mary's, drawn in 1850 by the church warden. And you can see the focus of this church is the pulpit, the big pulpit and sounding board. And at the back of the chancel, there's a whole bunch of panels with extracts from Scripture. And there's a whole bunch of these pews are what are known as box pews. They're nice little doors. And the nature of the service is very hierarchical. So the higher status families had the pews nearest the pulpit, and the further away from the pulpit you were, the lower status you were. The whole ethos of the service was on the written and spoken word. It was a rational experience. There's nothing sensory about it at all. So people would come in, they'd sit in their pews, they'd listen to a couple of hours of really boring sermons, and then they'd go. It was a very sterile environment. Now, the Anglican Church reacted to this through the Tractarians and ecclesiologists. The Tractarians were also known as the Oxford movement. There's a bunch of academics in Oxford, there's Pusey, Newman and Keble, who said that in order to repair the reputation of the Anglican Church, it was necessary to go back to a medieval form of worship. That's not Catholicism, but it's near Catholicism. It was bells and smells, it's high church, where you had a much more socially, emotionally engaged liturgy. And over in Cambridge, you had the ecclesiologists, and they were interested in architecture. And they said, not unreasonably, that if you wanted a medieval form of worship, you should have a medieval form of architecture, which was Gothic. So they were leading exponents of what's known as the Gothic revival. So you see these buildings all over the place with spires and crockets and finials and the like. And coming from that, you saw this, a massive wave of church building. So in this period of 40 years, there were a huge range of churches built. And there's two ways of church building in England over the last 10,000 years, was in the 11th century, when this place first started, and then this 40 years in the Victorian period. So they were two great ways of church building. And there's two Gothic revival churches in Ealing. Most of these new churches were in the northern industrial towns which were expanding, but the suburbs also had quite a few of them. From St Mary's perspective, the important thing is the refurbishment which took place. And you can see that 80% of the rural parish churches were refurbished in this period. And in part, it was because the churches were falling down, many, many years of dilapidation. But they also took the opportunity to change the nature of the church to go back to a high church feel, to move away from the low church of the previous period. And so in 1868, Mr. R. Wiley, local architect, refurbished this church. Now, before showing you what he came up with, just a reminder of what the church was like in 1850. Pulpit, screens at the back, no decoration, very austere. And then when Mr. Wiley got his paws on the place, it turned into this. This is about 25 years later. And you can see it's fundamentally different. The pulpit's gone, the sounding board's gone, the panels at the back with the scripture, that's all gone and been replaced by a large stained glass window with oak with a wooden reredos in front of it. There's a very elaborate altar there, which I'll show you a bit later. The pews have all been ripped out. They're now more normal pews, very egalitarian. And there's a screen between the chancel and the nave. And then, probably most significantly, is the chancel arch. Now, most medieval churches had an arch between the chancel and the nave. And so Mr. Wiley decided to put this thing in. A vast amount of masonry, has no structural purpose whatsoever. The church has stood up here perfectly fine for 500 or 600 years, but in order to get back to a medieval church, they decided to put an arch in. So this is evidence of how they wanted to get back to the medieval form of worship. It was a very high church approach. And of course, stained glass, lots and lots of stained glass, absolutely typical of virtually every church in the country, all industrially produced, very colourful, very nice, but not in any way exceptional. What is quite exceptional is this here, which was the altar put in by the Victorians, which is now at the back of the nave. And it's quite good. It's a very highly decorated wooden affair. A lot of altars put in at that time were stone, and nothing like as ornate as this. I suspect it could be worth quite a bit of study, because it's possibly quite an important piece of decoration. So that's the Victorian Reverend there. If we look outside, the renovation also affected the outside. You can see on the left, this is the church before the renovation, and the east chancel wall has got two large triangular buttresses holding the wall up, and a very small window. That was all replaced, the wall was taken out, big stained glass window put in, dressed stone walls, and two very narrow buttresses were put in. That will become quite important later. Now I'd just like to look at the churchyard, which I think becomes quite important now. Earlier this year, I'm wandering around England and looking at various churches. Here's a couple. One's in Clodagh in Herefordshire, and the other's along Melford in Suffolk. You can see that these churches, there's lots and lots of gravestones, very, very similar, simple gravestones. And you can't really see the extent of them, but they're very, very extensive, these churches. And when you look at the gravestones, look at the inscriptions, they are stout yeoman farmers, ploughmen, locals, artisans, horny-handed sons of toil, very local people. When you look at the churchyard of St Mary's, you get these sorts of gravestones, very ornate, very highly carved, very expensive, granite and marble, very, very different feel from a real typical rural parish church. And if you look at the inscriptions, you get this lot. These are not horny-handed sons of toil. These are the great and the good of the British Empire. Now, I shall just read you something like that. There's a book here which describes, right. In summary, the Graveguard contains an astonishing number of distinguished people. For the army, there is a general, 5 major generals, 2 lieutenant colonels, 2 colonels, 4 captains, and a lieutenant. For the navy, there are 4 admirals and a commander. And in civilian life, there is a baronet, 2 senior physicians, 5 senior colonials, a knight, and a sculptor. So this graveyard here is not the graveyard of a rural parish church. It is a Victorian cemetery. It is the great and the good of the British Empire go around doing what they do in the Empire, and when they come back, they want to be buried in a nice rural spot near London. And this is a nice rural spot near London. And the person who brought this all about was this guy here, Charles Hughes, rector of Perivale for 45 years. He's the subject of this book here, available on Amazon. It's by Jeff Pack. And he's a crook. He's dead now, so I can call him that. And he would essentially be selling off plots to all the people from the British Empire who wanted to be buried in a nice rural spot near London. He was taken to court in 1906 by his own churchwarden, which is quite amusing. The resolution of the case is very complicated, and you need to read the book to find out. But from an architectural history point of view, you do have this incongruity between the rural parish church and the graveyard. And that leads me to what I think is quite an important theme, which is that from the late 19th century, the important influence on the church was proximity to London. For 800 years, the most important thing was proximity to Brent, which really restricted what the church could do. But from the next 100 years, proximity to London started mattering. And this can be seen here. There was a new use for land. For 800 years, the only thing you could do with land which is prone to flooding was agriculture. But obviously now, golf. So Ealing was expanding like mad. The good burghers of Ealing wanted something to do at their time, and they bought up all the land around the river and turned it into a golf course. It's an Ealing Golf Course, founded in 1898. Of course, this land is great for golf. They don't play golf in winter, so they don't care about the flooding, and the river is a nice obstacle for the golf. So the consequence of this and subsequent purchases is that the only way to access the church is by public footpath over a golf course. So it's slightly unusual in that respect. Moving swiftly on, we get into the 1930s and the growth of Perivale. In 1930, they managed to put dams or to control the River Brent further upstream at the Welsh Harp. And consequently, you could start using the land. So the A40 was built between London and Oxford, and you can see it here snaking from left to right. It's a big main arterial road. And the period between 1919 and 1939 for England was a period of massive suburbanisation. There were 4 million houses built in that time. The urban area of England grew by 50% in 20 years. And that's just... And a large part of that was in the home counties around London and in particular Middlesex. And in particular along the Brent Valley, which was now accessible through this road. So in 1939, the most populous parish in England was Greenford, the next door parish to here. You can see this here you can see it in Perivale. So there's St Mary's, stuck in its golf course to the south of the A40. There's the Hoover building to the north of the A40. And there's some housing. That's the start of all the housing development, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of houses built to the north of the A40. And you can see that's the population of Perivale. It went from 50 to almost 10,000 in a blink of an eye. In fact, that would be higher if it wasn't for the fact that a third of Perivale is taken over by golf courses. So this was a major change for Perivale and for the church because it's boom time. The tower was refurbished. There's congregation now, therefore there's money, therefore the tower was completely refurbished, and the bells were recast and new ones were added. And the church was pretty well maintained, so that by 1960 the church was in pretty good shape. It's probably too small for its congregation, but it was quite well maintained. But then 1960s disaster, two disasters in fact. There we are. The first one was the Victorian change wasn't as well constructed as you might think, and the the wall of the chancel started coming away from the chancel itself, and so they had to prop it up with these big balks of timber that stopped the thing falling over. And then they almost took the chancel down and rebuilt it, and in doing so, they found this. This is an extract from a local newspaper, and under where I'm standing at the moment, there is a vault to the Millet family, and apparently there were 7 leather coffins in this vault which disintegrated when it came in contact with air, and there's a few funeral baskets which we've got upstairs. So it's quite amusing that I'm standing on a medieval church vault. But that's all closed over. It's not accessible anymore, which is much to Hugh's annoyance. I think he'd like to get down there. So in building the chancel, they found the vault, but then they rebuilt it, and this is roughly how they rebuilt it. It's important to recognise that in rebuilding it, they built this. Built in 1965, so this was when the Beatles were around and it was swinging London. So the rebuild was to a 1960s aesthetic, not a Victorian aesthetic. So this window here, some people don't like it, but it's certainly not a Victorian window. And that ceiling, you see, is Victorians wouldn't have had that. It's a very modern sort of decorative scheme. And if you look at the chancel in general, you see this. It's a beautiful cross up there, and it's beautifully lit and a far cry from what the Victorians would have had as their chancel. It's a beautiful space. So that was taking triumph out of disaster, but then there was another potential disaster in that as a rival. The church authorities were sick and tired of their parishioners getting mown down crossing the A40. So they built a new church to the north of the A40, St Nicholas in Perivale. And there's no houses to the south of the A40, so everyone, all the thousands of people living in Perivale, went to this as their church. And it could have sounded the death knell for St Mary's. In 1972, 7 years after this chancel was built, the church was closed. But Prince Charming came along, and essentially a 99-year lease was signed, and the Friends of St Perivale took over the church and have been running it ever since. Initially, they ran it as a community space, but since 2005, its emphasis has been on classical music. That there is a picture of the classical music concert here. Many of you will have seen this. It's quite interesting that in architecture they have this idea of form follows function, form and function. So the physical form of a building should be determined by its function. And that's, for 800 years, that's roughly what happened with this church. Every time there was a change in function, they changed the church. They'd put a chancel on, they'd knock a window down. So the church adapted to the functions required. But now this is a Grade 1 listed building, so the form is fixed. So you can't change the physical space here. And therefore we're in an era of trying to find functions to fit the form. The form is fixed, so you've got to find the functions for the form. And this is a real challenge for churches all over England. So there's 20 churches a year get closed, most of the medieval churches in remote spots. There's 1,000 Anglican churches on the at-risk register. So finding a function to fit a fixed form is incredibly important. And fortunately, we've done this. And I think this classical music concert, what you see here, is actually not far removed from a medieval mass. You have this beautiful space here. This is where the ceremony takes place. The music, to my mind, is pretty miraculous. And you've got a priest, Hugh, who manages it all. And then you have a big space for the peasantry, for the audience. And so this form is actually very well suited to the function which it's found. And indeed, the fact that it's a small church acts to its benefit. A large church, you wouldn't get the same intimate experience. So this church, very, very fortunately, has found a function which can be very, very useful, which is good. Although this is not something which can be spread to all parish churches across the country, because it really does depend on it being in London. And there's a human resources in this area which does allow this function to work. So you've got a whole bunch of retired BBC sound engineers doing the sound. You've got a very sophisticated audience, and you've got musicians who can get here by tube. So this function is not just down to the nature of the building, but also to this location in London. Anyway, in summary, I said at the start that this was a rural parish church in London, and I think if you look at the first 800 or 900 years of its existence, it went through these phases. And if I were to do this sort of exercise on any medieval church in England, you'd go through this exercise. They all went through a period of growth. Some grew more than others. There was lots of specific local issues, but they all went through a period of growth in the Middle Ages, the Reformation, decline in the 18th, 19th century, and refurbishment in the 19th century. So that's a very, very common pattern. And it's only about now that some unique characteristics develop because it's near London. So gradually London put a Victorian cemetery around this, and then it then became part of a golf club, and then became part of a much bigger suburban expansion. And it's now, because it's in London, that new uses have been found. So that's the summary, and the end note. For a small church, there's a lot of history. Does anyone have any questions? What do I do now?
I've got a question.
Oh, fine. Yeah.
Where's the microphone?
I don't know.
Oh, I must be.
I'm about a mile away.
Get a microphone.
Oh,
A microphone. This is so that the people on the interweb can hear.
You're on.
yeah. I live about a mile away in Greenford, which has a very charming and old church, probably about the same age as this one. And I just wondered what the connection, if any, because it's only about a mile away.
I've looked at it. It's Church of St. Richard with St. Mary with Richard, isn't it? On the hill on Northolt. Oh no, sorry.
No. It's
right.
behind the big church, Holy Cross.
Yeah, the Church of the Holy Cross. There is a big connection there. There's a very fine funerary monument in the nave of Simon Coston. Yeah. And that was dated. That's his wife's funerary monument, dated 1639. And it's got an effigy of him. He was a very flamboyant character. To put your effigy in your wife's funerary monument would suggest that. But it's similar. It does have a timber tower, like we have here, but it's slightly grander, because Greenford is about 2,000 acres compared to our 840. So it's a much bigger parish and therefore more wealthy. The more interesting comparison is between this and the church in Northolt, because it's almost exactly the same design, same walls, same windows, and I think that both the Northolt parish and Perivale were given to the same knight, Geoffrey de Manville, after the Norman conquest. So that's a very, very similar church to this, but it's still used as a church.
Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Dermot. Fascinating. And I have two questions which you probably may have no evidence for in answering. But I remember in one of the questionnaires that Hugh runs here every 2 years, one of the respondents said he's given up coming here because he's convinced that this church is built on a site of human sacrifice. So have you found any reference or any evidence at all that might be true? Secondly, you talked about the thatch roof and the wooden structure. Is there any evidence of any fire at all?
Oh, of any?
Fire?
No.
No.
There's no evidence of fire, and if there were, you probably see scorch marks and the like. So there's no evidence of fire, and there's no evidence of human remains. I take part with the little gardening group we have on Thursday morning, and I dig around quite furiously. If I find any skulls, I shall put them to one side, but no evidence. You had a question? Yeah.
There you go.
Yes, I was just wondering, a general question really. Do churches, when they change their use, have to be deconsecrated, and how do they do that if they put a churchyard?
Well, this isn't deconsecrated.
It isn't?
No, no.
Ah, so you could still have a service here.
I think
or
we do, don't
weddings
we?
Here and...
Yeah. You might know.
It's redundant, but consecrated still. So we have carol, as you know, we have carol services and things. Yeah. And local parishes sometimes use it for away days. We don't even charge them.
So that you.
I'm very interested in the life of Charles Hughes, and I think you indicated that he was very good at raising money for himself. I do know that he used to sell lemonade to very thirsty golfers. He made a lot of money out of that. I just wonder whether you had any other stories about Charles Hughes?
All right. Well, I really refer you to the book. I'm not taking the cut on this, by the way, but he was a very, very colourful character. Just the social history, I'm architectural history, so I'll be out of my depth if I start making comment, but I do recommend reading the book. It's he was very high church, so the move from the low church to the high church was very much inspired by him, and he attracted very large congregations by being very high church. I don't have any particular stories I can convey.
Just a couple of questions, if I may, and they all relate to the origins of the church.
Mm-hmm.
The original building is the bit we're sitting in, isn't it, here?
Yeah.
And what percentage of the current building is relatively unscathed original work? And secondly, have you found, or has anyone found, any timber in that original part of the building whereby we could do some aging, well, dating of the building due to the annual ring cycle?
Yeah. Dendrochronological dating. Yeah. So there is a dating technique where you get a timber, you get a core out of it, and you count the tree rings.
Yes.
We could do that. It's very expensive.
Sorry?
It's very expensive to do that. And
are you saying, sorry to interrupt you, are you saying there is timber
not
in this?
No, but up here.
But this roof is relatively modern, isn't it?
No. That roof is 1400, so it's 500 years, 600 years old.
1400
Yeah.
instead of 1200.
Yeah. I'm
really just trying to get to getting the method of dating the original church.
Well, the original church, it doesn't have timber in it. It's masonry, and you can't date that.
No, I know you can't.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether in this fabric there were some bits of timber.
That I haven't found any. Yeah. There's lots of timber, but it's not. Doesn't go back to the 12th century.
Okay.
Pity. If I find any, I'll.
If you do.
Yeah.
So why sorry. What was the roof formed of before 1400?
Well, it would have been timber, but
so
it would have
they had to replace it, but not because of fire.
Not because of fire, but it wouldn't have had the same amount of timber. It would be a much lighter structure because thatch is lighter than the clay tiles.
Oh, I see. It was.
Yeah.
This was after the thatch. This was.
Yeah, this was put in to support after the thatch.
Yes.
Take the thatch down, put that in, and put tiles on top. I think no evidence where it seems sensible.
I'm rather sorry you sort of laid the ghost of our lovely stories about the leper window and the weeping chancel.
Truth, you got to go with truth. Sorry about that, mate.
I I mean, they're such nice stories. Any other questions? Please.
Has there ever been any architectural work done around the church to try to age certain parts of it?
The nearest we've got is what I've been doing, I think. So the approach I've taken is what any historical building analysis would take. I just started this, and if you've got somebody who's much more experienced, they might be able to come up with some different conclusions or different nuance. But not that I'm aware of, there's no real formal architectural analysis of the church.
For what it's worth, the list of rectors at the back goes back to 1330, which is getting towards there. And as Dermot says, there is a definite record to the little church by the Brent in Little Greenford in 1203. But there's remarkably little apart from that of documents, anything to do with the building of the church. And we've looked and there's just not much to find. Off you go.
So was this church not mentioned in the Domesday Book?
No. But churches often weren't mentioned in the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book was interested in land values, and sometimes they do mention it, but many, many times they weren't.
Any other questions? Well, I think it remains to thank Dermot for an absolutely fascinating talk, not just about this church's history, but how it fits in to the history of our dear country over the last 1,000 years, and how changes in religious life of the church have been reflected in the building and everything else. And I see this glorious building in a new light now, and I think its future is assured. Provided we go on doing concerts and you lot keep coming, we'll be all right for another 1,000 years. Who knows? Anyway, can you all now give Dermot a big round of applause?
Oh, God. Oh, God.
I'd also like to thank George Auckland and Rob Jenkins for doing the broadcast and fixing up all the equipment here, which is very complicated when you're putting on slides both for an audience here and putting them live over the internet. It's very complicated. We have a fabulous technical team, and I'm very grateful to George and Rob for doing the honours this evening. Very grateful to my wife for doing box office. And thank you very much for watching, if you have been watching. And we're now going to have some wine and crisps. Thank you very much for being with us. The next concert is on Sunday afternoon, when we have a very good piano trio playing Beethoven's Archduke Piano Trio, amongst other things. Thank you very much, and from St Mary's Perivale, a very good evening to you.
Wow.